Final Fantasy VII, a necessity for gracious living. Undoubtedly, the original Final Fantasy VII on the Sony PlayStation was one of the most influential games ever. Beyond being a legendary title that Metacritic currently has sat comfortably at a score of 92, it is often recognised as one of the greatest games ever made. The iconic game that helped solidify turn-based RPGs from Japan as viable releases throughout the West gave Sony a bullet in its arsenal to be the dominant 32-bit console and truly showcased the importance of multi-disc based gaming. This video game was huge compared to anything before it, and as narrative stories grew with time, developers needed all the space they could get. Of course, this was a significant reason why the Nintendo 64 fell behind Sony's newest juggernaut, a particular pain point for the Big N, especially considering their broken partnership with the Japanese electronics giant and Sony's cancelled PlayStation Super Nintendo add-on. With the shadow of Final Fantasy VII looming large over the gaming world, eons ago there was a moment when Final Fantasy VII was not planned for the PlayStation, but rather the SNES. So let's look at this overlooked historical period and see what could have been. So with all that said, I am Lady Decade, and this is the very early development of Final Fantasy VII. But before we get fully into the swing of things, I wanted to thank all of you who subscribed to this channel in the last few weeks. In the last 7 days alone, 2,100 of you hit subscribe, pushing the channel over the 90,000 subscriber mark and even closer to that coveted 100k silver play button. By so many of you subscribing recently, you are effectively supercharging this channel in the algorithm, and for that, I am eternally grateful. I literally can't tell you how much it means to me that you like my content enough to do that, so thank you. Anyway, time to chat about Final Fantasy VII. To do this, let's rewind to the franchise's early days. There is no better place to start than counting up from 1. The first title in the franchise, Final Fantasy, was released on the Nintendo Famicom in 1987, quickly followed by 2 in 1988 and 3 in 1990. While in the 21st century, we now have numerous ways to play this original 8-bit trilogy in English. Only the first title was translated for English release. Even then it was restricted to North America, so there was no Final Fantasy at all for most of the planet. While a celebrated genre, RPGs are known for their substantial dialogue. Presumably the late 80s gamers sought arcade experiences at home rather than slow burn role-playing games. Those guys weren't ready for that yet, but their kids would love it. Surprisingly, an American release of Final Fantasy II was planned at one point and even marketed by Squaresoft, subtitled Dark Shadow over Palakia, with a prototype cartridge even being produced, but sadly the translation didn't get far enough by the time the Super Nintendo Entertainment System was on its way. It looked like a losing battle to release a substantially translated release of a 1988 game when Mode 7 would be wowing players soon enough. Likewise, Final Fantasy III was considered for a Western release, but didn't seem to have gotten as far as 2 did before it was abandoned. With the Super Nintendo in full swing globally, by 1991, the Japanese game Final Fantasy IV would release in North America as Final Fantasy II, as Squaresoft found it would be confusing for players to jump from 1 to 4. Censored for religious themes in the English release and modified to be a bit easier for the audience that might not be used to this genre, Japan would eventually see a re-release of the game. Now known as Final Fantasy IV Easy Type, it took some of these adjustments and saw how the home nation audience would take it. A game I like to refer to as Final Fantasy IV Pussy Ass Edition. Final Fantasy V would go on to be released in Japan in the last month of 1992, but once again skipped for North American audiences, and Final Fantasy VI would come as Final Fantasy III, once again renumbering the title for those who would be wondering what happened to 3, 4 and 5. Beyond the standard visual and dialogue adjustments to the game, Squaresoft had begun running into the limits of the cartridge medium. The English version had to have the text files abridged due to the limitations of ROM size. Japanese characters can fit more dialogue per character than English characters that build up to a complete word. So, to truly fit the breadth of the dialogue in the English version, Squaresoft would have to boost up the storage on the cartridge. But that's a problem for the West and not for the home base in Japan, right? So surely this won't come up again. When Final Fantasy VI was released in 1994 and within spitting distance of the Sony PlayStation being released, while the Super Nintendo would continue to have games released until 1998, clearly the next generation was revving up and developers would have to decide where they'd go next and during this time of progression. At least at one point, Squaresoft considered placing their next title, Final Fantasy VII, on the Super Famicom once more. Work on Final Fantasy VII for the Super Nintendo had finally begun. After the production of Final Fantasy VI concluded, creator Hironobu Sakaguchi stepped back to the simple role of producer and let Yoshinori Kitase, a director of Final Fantasy VI, take the lead on the new title. Kitase would say in an interview with Polygon, "At the time, it wasn't clear yet whether Japanese RPGs were going to go 3D or not. Sakaguchi-san was especially fond of pixel art, and we debated a lot about whether we should remain in that 2D style. After we finished Final Fantasy VI, we began working on Final Fantasy VII as a 2D game for Super Famicom, brainstorming and holding initial planning meetings. I think we had about 60 people in total working on Final Fantasy VI. When we started pre-production for Final Fantasy VII on Super Famicom, it was probably a little smaller than that, maybe 20 to 30 people. But at that time, Chrono Trigger's development was in dire straits, so all the team members switched over to help with Chrono Trigger, and that's as far as it went." Sakaguchi would back up this discussion. "Before we made Chrono Trigger, we had talked about making Final Fantasy VII, but then we moved everyone over to the Chrono Trigger team. I do recall now, I did write a scenario for Final Fantasy VII, a different story than the one we eventually used. I don't remember it being in New York though. You know, I think the New York idea might be from Parasite Eve. And Joe, that's actually the original name I had for the protagonist from Lost Odyssey. I don't know, maybe all this information is getting mixed up somewhere." I love how people who were actually there during the period of the development of Final Fantasy VII for the SNES can't fully remember what happened. Speaking of Parasite Eve though, while Square, now Square Enix, is a bit cagey on what was attempted in the 1990s, clearly there's some miscommunication. Still, it was at least posited that the original scenario for Final Fantasy VII may have been set in New York City and featured a detective. This may or may not have been repurposed for Parasite Eve on the PlayStation, squaring off with a sorceress and featuring a general theme of life throughout the production. In either case, New York City or the final world of Midgar, Final Fantasy VII was destined to be a relatively contemporary reimagining of what an RPG could be. Between Chrono Trigger, Parasite Eve and Final Fantasy VII, the ideas proposed for the original title, at least the ones worth salvaging, were spread about between the three titles. But Squaresoft did work on the title, even if it was just for a few months, so there must be some evidence supporting this, surely? Well, yes, or I wouldn't be making this video. Final Fantasy's 25th anniversary Ultramania, a celebration of the franchise on its 25th anniversary, shares a single solitary image from the Super Famicom program. Borrowing character sprites from Final Fantasy VI, 3 characters are seen in some rustic farmland. This could be a prologue or before the action transitioned to New York City, as it's not explicitly archaic but seems to be a bit out of step from what the final project would be. If anything, it may simply have been artists experimenting with a general graphic design for the title and not based on any planned area. Once Final Fantasy VI was published, Square would still have several unforgettable hits to come out on the Super Famicom, Final Fantasy VII or not. Front Mission, Chrono Trigger, Seiken Densetsu 3, Romancing Saga 3, Bahamut Lagoon, and Super Mario RPG would all be part of their 1995 through 1997 lineup. Wrapping up production on the Super Nintendo with Treasure of the Rudrus being the last developed game. Treasure Hunter G would be the last published game for the now aging 16-bit console. After the Super Nintendo 2D experiments, Squaresoft would begin experimenting with 3D for one of the future consoles for a while, with the general public believing that Final Fantasy VII would be debuting on the Nintendo 64 rather than the PlayStation. Of course, ultimately the allure of the disc-based space the PlayStation provided would be a siren call to steal Square away from Nintendo. But that doesn't mean the idea of Final Fantasy VII on the 64 wasn't dabbled with. In fact, I have made a substantial deep dive video covering this endeavour, so I would strongly advise you to click on the annotation and watch that one now after hitting that subscribe button for me. Thank you to everyone who is still watching, and thank you once more for subscribing. Mwah!